And yes, I admit it's a little bit of a provocative title, but it becomes apparent what I mean by that later on. It just obviously it literally means revelation. So I will explain exactly what I mean as we go through. Nothing destructive. So basically, the presentation is in two parts really. The first 3 points on this slide are just referring to my own kind of personal experiences and some of the implications from those. And then in the second part of the talk, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about synchronicity, which I experience an awful lot of, and whether we can kind of expand the concept a little bit. So to begin with, I'll just talk a little bit about how I got to where I am now. As Chantal mentioned, I studied natural sciences at Cambridge University, and then I went off to do a PhD in geology. And after that, I started working as a geologist for an oil company in Cairo in 2005, where I started to experience feelings of kind of paranoia. And essentially feelings that my calls and emails were being monitored. And the way this kind of manifested itself was the idea that essentially conversations between office colleagues would include unusual phrases that I maybe used in a different context during personal phone conversations with a partner back in the UK. It was this kind of feeling of being watched that slowly kind of started to develop. And I came back to the UK in 2006, and I wondered whether it was just the environment that I was living in, and working in, and whether if I changed my jobs, my career, or whatever, then things would improve. So I actually moved to a different company, a different organization, but I still had that feeling that essentially somebody was trying to kind of direct my life from behind the scenes. So it got to 2008, and I thought, right, well, maybe I really need to kind of just change direction. And I started at this point to think, well, I'll tell you what I can do. I can just have a clean break, get in control of my own destiny, and start my own small business in Crystal Palace, which is an area of Southeast London. I decided to open a small delicatessen shop. But I still experienced these kind of meaningful coincidences when people came into the shop, the feeling that essentially that I was being monitored, and it was paranoia. And by the time we got to July 2008, the range of coincidences and whatever, it seemed to expand in my mind to include the media and the state. And kind of from this point onwards, I basically thought I was in a kind of a grand conspiracy. And underlying all of that, I still had this feeling that somebody was trying to contact me for reasons unknown, but by using indirect means, not being direct about it, which was really frustrating. And by the time we got to September, this was the time of the bank bailouts during the global financial crisis. And that kind of meant that the future for the business didn't look particularly good. And my personal situation wasn't fantastic either, because I started to think my house was bugged, that people were listening to my mobile phone, and that I was basically just playing a role in a highly elaborate theatre movie script. And it got to the stage where, I'll be honest, I was referred to mental health specialists in Southeast London who prescribed antipsychotic medication, which I refused to take. And the reason I refused to take it was because I could see all these coincidences happening in the outside world. They didn't feel as though they were going on in my head. I wasn't hallucinating. And I didn't think that altering my brain chemistry was going to adjust what I could see in the outside world. So this was a difficult period. And I just want to focus on one particular moment in this period of autumn-fall 2008. So by this stage, I believed that I was in this kind of this grand conspiracy. And I got it into my head that essentially this business, this shop on the opposite side of the road to where I was working, was a front for this conspiracy. This business had just opened up, and I thought that they'd done it deliberately, basically, to come and get me. And I was very angry about this. And I came very close to literally walking across the road with a broom to smash up the shop, because I thought that these people were all against me, and I was very, very angry about this. But something stopped me, and I put the broom down, and I walked to the back of the shop, and I switched on the tap to a sink that was in the back of the shop. And I was kind of in this kind of state of quite, kind of emotional intensity. And I was watching the water come out of this tap, and as I was watching it, it went from full flow down to a trickle and then back to full flow again over the space of a couple of seconds. And there was no logical reason why that happened. There weren't any plumbers there. It'd never done it before. But one thing that it did do was it kind of took my mind off the situation as it was happening there during this kind of intense emotional period. But I didn't really understand it at that point at all. So as I say, 2008 was not good. And by the time we got to early 2009, I actually ended up being sectioned in the Bethlehem Royal Hospital. And Bethlehem is the oldest psychiatric hospital in the UK. It's commonly known as Bedlam. And basically it was for refusing to take antipsychotic medication, which, as I said, I didn't want to take because I thought all these things were happening in the real world, as it were. But on the second day I was there, this was a new environment, and on the second day that I was there, a new patient came in called John, and he was quite an eccentric guy, and he talked at me and he said, I'm God, and he kept claiming that he was God. But the funny thing about him was that he seemed to be also very intuitive, as if the kind of things I was seeing on the outside world were the same things that were happening here, but only with much more intensity, as though he kind of could somehow unconsciously understand aspects of my life. It was a very, very strange conversation and very intense. And it's so intense, in fact, that I actually found it quite stressful, and I was struggling to get to sleep that night. And so I was lying in my bed on this second night, as it were, and I was actually counting sheep to try and get to sleep. And the way I was doing that was I was imagining sheep jumping over the top of a tent. I just had this mental image of sheep jumping over a tent. It was just my way of counting these things. And then the next day, there was basically an art therapy session. And one of the other patients in this art therapy session said, about halfway through, said, I've just thought of something really strange. I've thought of sheep jumping over a tent, which for me was a really shocking statement, because up until that point, I thought that people were reading my emails, listening to my phone calls, and it now seemed as though they could read my mind as well, which was absolutely shocking, considering where I'd come from. And I didn't, I tried to kind of assimilate it. I didn't mention it really to other people because I thought it wouldn't go down too well. So I just kind of kept it to myself. And then actually 12 days later, I left the hospital because I wasn't seen as being particularly a threat. But it started to dawn on me as I was leaving that essentially the rules of reality that I'd grown up with no longer really applied to what I was now witnessing. And what I'd actually, according to my original worldview, what I'd been seeing, the only rational explanation for these things was that I was in some kind of grand conspiracy. And I now started to think, the penny started to drop, that maybe these anomalous experiences were some kind of spiritual communication that I'd misinterpreted. And it was actually a couple of days after I came out of the hospital that I kind of chanced upon synchronicity almost through doing kind of Google searches and whatever. And I came across Jung, and I started reading about all this stuff that I'd never really heard of before whatsoever. And what I now understood as being synchronicities, these coincidences, actually started to lead me to doubt the existence of free will, and I started to accept the ideas of fate and superdeterminism, but without fatalism. Just the amount of patterning I was getting kind of led me in that direction. So these were the kind of things that I was thinking of at that time. And then one other particular incident that I quickly like to talk about also happened in spring 2009. And this was shortly after I came out of this hospital. And a number of people at that time were trying to contact me for kind of obvious reasons to kind of get in touch and whatever. But I was at a state where I wanted to spend time on my own to kind of work out what was going on. And I had some quite angry conversations with people, just saying, look, please leave me alone. I need space at the moment. And one of these kind of conversations was with my mother. And she called me when I was down in Brighton, which is a town on the south coast of Britain. And so I said, yeah, just leave me alone. It was quite, like I say, quite an intense, angry conversation, but I just needed space. And after I had this conversation, I walked into a pub and I bought a pint of Guinness. This was the only pint of Guinness I bought. I wasn't sitting there drinking all day, but I just, I bought this pint of Guinness. I went outside and I sat down with it and I put it on the table. And when I put it on the table, a shamrock just appeared in the head of this Guinness. It wasn't put there by the barman. It was absolutely perfect in form. I would describe it as being almost like a platonic shamrock, in that it was perfect, and it was made up of different sized bubbles. So the bubbles right at the center of the pattern but were large, and it finally graded out towards the edge of the shamrock. And it was, as I say, absolutely perfect. It's completely different to human created shamrocks, and I've never seen anything quite like it before or since, to be honest with you. So it was quite a strange experience. And the other thing that I started to notice in spring, summer 2009 were muscle fasciculation. So pulses basically in my muscles in different parts of my body. It wasn't a spasm, it wasn't in one place, but they would happen all over the place, and they would happen often at times of meaning. And it got to the point where actually in 2019, I went to a neurologist just to check that my nervous system and muscles and everything are functioning correctly, which they seem to be. So there's not a problem there, but these things do seem to happen at kind of times of meaning. So for example, Well, here's some from a record that I've been taking. So I get a strong pulse in my right thigh when I say God in exasperation at something at 7:20 p.m. on the 25th of June 2019. 16th of August 2019, I'm returning from a day trip to Cambridge on the train. This is just after 10 o'clock at night, and I get a pulse in my left thigh at the same time as an audible creak in the train as it goes around a corner between two stations in East London. 1st of September 2019, I'm reading a book and I get a pulse in my right tricep at the line, religious people have apparent visitations. 29th of December, I'm watching a YouTube video entitled Project Deep Quest, and just over 10 minutes into the video, the thumb of my left hand basically kind of moves downwards and kind of comes back up at a shot of a submarine hydraulic arm. And the line, I extended my articulated manipulator and dug it into the bottom and pulled out the first artifact. And this is something else that I sometimes get. It seems like that my fingers sometimes have a kind of mind of their own as it works. It's very strange. Another book. So here, yes, during the line, while the narrator stood in front of the cameras on the very premises of Jung's Swiss home, lightning struck the same garden where the tree had been formerly located, followed by a dramatic roll of thunder. And then another one here. So Psychology Today, an article there. At the line, this was orchestrated by something with wits. I get a couple of pulses in my left tricep. So I get these things quite a lot, as if something's with me, essentially. And all these things are basically combined into this kind of flip of worldview that's kind of gradually happened over the years, from agnosticism to, I suppose, a spiritual creator of everything, sometimes with this kind of tricksterish Peter Pan character. And I think, basically responsible for our actions on both a kind of conscious and unconscious level, while giving us this apparent sense of free will. And that's certainly where I sit on it. And we're all a part of this entity. And I would say it's for me, it's more of a knowledge than a belief, given some of my personal experiences. But I'm aware that basically, everyone has their own viewpoint, and that's absolutely fine. But I do think that there are some implications that really need to come out of stuff like this. And I will say quite strongly that the last 15 years have been quite difficult at times, basically because I've been confronting a whole load of internal and external barriers as being a result of being immersed in this kind of dominant materialist worldview that we're all sat in. And I do think, extremely strongly that the Western mental health community needs to be properly trained in people-centered psychotherapy, psychoanalysis with a spiritual bent, alongside just prescribing antipsychotic medication as a kind of easy option. Because I think it would be quite straightforward if in 2008, somebody trained in kind of psychoanalysis had introduced me to the idea of synchronicity. It would have explained an awful lot about the coincidence I was experiencing and would have reduced those feelings of paranoia early on. So I really do think that there needs to be much more spirituality within the mainstream psychiatric profession. And I know that there are inroads being made, but it's still very much a kind of a marginal thing. By the same token, obviously, I know it's difficult, and I know this myself, it's very difficult to talk about spiritual experiences and spiritual emergences in the worldview that we live in. Each journey is very unique, but there are commonalities between them, and the more that we can talk about these things, the better. So this is the apocalypse I'm talking about, an unveiling of the occult, the unveiling of the hidden. That's what I have in mind. And I mean, I just wonder, whether a consistency of definition is helpful. Look, for me, this spiritual aspect is always kind of with me. It has intelligence, and I call it God because essentially most people understand what that is. Everyone on the street has an opinion one way or the other on this, and it's a name that people undergoing a spiritual journey can understand. Maybe it's different for different people, but it was certainly helpful for me. And with this kind of in mind, one reason that I actually permanently changed my name in 2016 was to make it very clear where I stand. And I'll be honest, no, I'm not suffering from solipsism, grandiosity, or an inflated ego. As Ram Dass previously said, Richard Alpert once wrote, "Sure, man, you're Christ and I'm Christ too." And I totally agree with that. I will say now, I believe I'm God, but everybody else is God as well. We're all part of God, the kingdom of heavens within, etc., etc. And I do think that in order to make people more aware of, spiritual phenomena, it is necessary to be kind of open, proud, and accessible, very much as the kind of, the gay community has gay pride. So I have no problem essentially calling myself God, and I make no apologies for that, as long as it's, obvious that I think everybody else is as well. I think it's just necessary to be open on this. I feel very strongly about all this because it's been a long old journey. But that was the first part of the talk, and I just wanted to kind of go on to something, now I've finished my rant, as it were, onto something that is perhaps a little bit more interesting. And it's the idea of expanding the idea of synchronicity a little bit, the connection between the microcosm and the macrocosm, and maybe kind of bringing enchantment back into the world a little bit. Because as Umberto Eco wrote, the medievals inhabited a world filled with references, reminders, overtones of divinity, and the manifestations of God in things, so correspondence with the idea of a noosphere, a global consciousness. And I just wonder if we do this, we might be able to kind of bring a little bit of enchantment back into the world through, I don't know, through a global synchronicity project, or utilizing a website or an app where essentially people can contribute their own connections to make people more aware of the connections between people and between events and nature, to make us a lot less individualistic. And the reason why I'm talking about connecting people with global events is because what those global events could do is act as a platform that lots of people could plug into. Everyone has their own synchronistic experiences. Everyone has a different objective aspect to those experiences, but these are it's the subjective aspect of those experiences, but these are the kind of the large scale objective aspects that we could look at. So I just want to talk about two quick examples. This is something that happened to me at the start of May, and it's very, very much based in Northwest Europe, I'm afraid, but it was a result of the UK leaving the European Union last year. Basically, there was a kind of a diplomatic fight early on in May about getting the French fishing fleet getting access to Jersey's territorial waters. Now, Jersey is a small island that lies about 14 miles off the coast of France, and it receives 95% of its electricity directly from France. And basically, France threatened to cut off the electricity supply to Jersey unless the UK granted more access to their fishing fleet. So that's the kind of the macrocosm, as it were. Now, why did I feel like I connected to this? Well, essentially, I happen to live in an area of West London, Earl's Court, which lies very close to South Kensington with its kind of heavy French presence. There's a lot of French people that live around here. The French embassy is very nearby. So that's one aspect. The other part of this is that, as most of us do, I pay an electricity bill, but I rarely adjust how much I pay. And so that's kind of my background. But it just so happens that on the 3rd of May, at about 8 o'clock in the morning, I just kind of spontaneously decide that I want to increase the amount of money I'm paying to my electricity account. And I do that through an increase in my direct debit and an additional payment. And my electricity supplier is a company called EDF Energy, which is Electricity de France. It's a French electricity company that basically operates in the UK. And I do this to make up a shortfall in my account and some recent electricity price increases. So I decide to do that, and I get a confirmatory email from EDF slightly later on. And then, completely separate to this, I also submit a job application for the role of science educator at the Natural History Museum, which is located in French South Kensington, directly opposite the French embassy consulate there. So these are the kind of things I'm doing. And then at 9:30 that night, on the 4th of May, this is when the first report appears about the threat of France cutting off the electricity supply to Jersey. I get about an hour later, I get another email from EDF confirming my payment. And then the following day, this whole thing escalates, and it gets to the stage where Boris Johnson's think of sending in the gunboats to defend Jersey. Obviously, this is a bit, it doesn't mean very much, but in terms of a sign or anything like that. But I felt like a connection between what I was doing here and what was happening, over in Jersey. So, that was the kind of the first experience, or one particular example of a kind of synchronicity that I was feeling there. The second example, I should warn you, is a little bit tragic, as some news events are. Now, this young guy is a 9-year-old boy called Jordan Banks. Unfortunately, he died in the middle of May because he was struck by lightning. And he was struck by lightning during a football coaching session. He was described as an extraordinary young man, a superstar footballer. And I hope to end all of this on a bit more of a positive note. But I just want to give you a bit of background to what was going on. So this particular week also happened to be quite a tumultuous week in kind of global events, in that on the Monday, on the 10th of May, rockets had been fired by Hamas from Gaza into Israel, and the Israelis responded with airstrikes on Gaza. And it was the first time since 2014 that happened. And on a much smaller scale, that same day, I booked up to see Michael Grosso present a talk entitled Miracles in the Age of Disbelief, Theory and Practice with the Scientific and Medical Network. And my interest here is obviously based on some of the experiences I had in the past. And then the following day at 5 p.m. was when this boy unfortunately died after being struck by lightning during a football coaching session, as reported later on during the BBC website, on the BBC website. But it also turned out to be the same night, or the biggest night in the English Soccer League, in that Manchester City won the Premier League title. So it's equivalent to the Super Bowl almost. You know, it's a very big night in soccer. I buy a book of the Miracles in the Age of Disbelief on the following day. But then in the evening, I'm reading an update on this news report. And at this point, this young boy has been named as Jordan Banks. And while I'm reading this, I get a couple of pulses in my right tricep, which always means to me that I'm kind of really need to kind of direct my attention. And one of the things that was said in the report was, on average in the UK, 2 people are killed by lightning every year. But there's also a comment from a meteorologist called Simon King, which is kind of representative, I think, of some of the kind of dismissive comments sometimes, as a result of the kind of the paradigm that we live in, which was essentially to say, well, lightning isn't uncommon, especially during the spring and summer months. There were an estimated 3,000 lightning strikes across northern England between 1600 BST and midnight on Tuesday. And I know this is a sensitive subject, and obviously you wouldn't talk about this in a report, but it's worth thinking about here, what are the odds of a child footballer called Jordan Banks at a football coaching session being struck by lightning on the same evening that the Premier League winners were decided, on the same week the conflict was happening in Israel on the banks of the River Jordan and Gaza? Now, you can say that I'm making connections between things that are not warranted, but I would disagree in that I think anyone that looks at synchronicities is looking at patterns and trends in the same way as any scientist is looking for trends in data. Just to finish this off, there was a website on the BBC the following day, just updating the situation in Gaza, which had seen 65 people killed, including 14 children and 7 dead in Israel. So in a way, this was what you might call a sign, in that it's kind of bringing attention to maybe the people of the UK that the situation overseas, is obviously not so great, and that there needs to be a connection here between the kind of the sublimated war of soccer, as it were, and real conflicts that should be the focus of active diplomacy. And it could be summarized in this idea that one of those children dying in the Middle East on the banks of the Jordan could have been one of our own in the UK. Now, look, I know this is just interpretation, and it's obviously a tragic event, and I want to kind of finish on a bit of a more positive note. But I think that, apart from my own personal experiences and the need for more openness and pride and openness with people having spiritual experiences and more adequate representation in the mainstream media, I think there would be something to be gained from thinking about how we can look at these global synchronicities and signs in a bit more detail. Because again, going back to Umberto Eco, he's writing, even at its most dreadful, so even during the lightning strikes, nature appeared to the symbolical imagination to be a kind of alphabet through which God spoke to men. Things were signs. Hope was restored to the world because, the world was God's discourse to humans. And with this in mind, this is why I was just thinking, do other people experience global scale synchronicities, signs and connections in this way? And if so, would it be worth kind of trying to investigate these in more detail, try to report them in more detail? And even just having the enthusiasm to do it might encourage synchronicities to occur as per, this idea of a synchronicity of synchronicity, as previous authors have written about. Alan Vaughan and Gary Schwartz have talked about the fact that if you actually investigate these things, they actually start to occur. I'll be very, very quick because I know I'm running out of time. But even as a result of putting this presentation together, I've just noticed a few things that seem to have happened in correspondence to what I've been doing. So, for example, I actually recorded a copy of this presentation with Healthy Seminars on 5 p.m. on the 12th of July. And at 5 p.m. while I was doing this, actually electrical storm came in, and Laura and Lorianne might remember me saying that there was a whole load of lightning bolts and everything happening outside. Now that in itself doesn't mean much, it's just an electrical storm. But later on, I discovered it was actually quite a major electrical storm, and it flooded most of the roads and around here, and also some of the underground stations. But more interesting than all of that is that at 5:05, there was actually a lightning strike that took place under a tree. Basically, a lightning strike hit 3 people who were under a tree, and they took a selfie. They were taking a selfie of themselves at the same time as the lightning strike hit. And this image on the right-hand side It was taken by Isabel Jobson. They all survived, luckily, and her two siblings. And that is the photo she actually took at 5:05 on the 12th of July as the lightning strike, as it hit. And interestingly enough, on the previous night, there was also another set of people who unfortunately died taking selfies in India. So there was two events involving people taking selfies 24 hours apart. So it starts to get a little bit interesting. And just to finish on a more positive note, I would just like to say that on the 21st of July was the day that the SPR library reopened again. And I managed to get back to the library and return some books that I'd had for over a year because of COVID. And I just happened to notice on display a book called Change in a Flash by Elizabeth Crone and Jeffrey Kripal about an NDE experience following a lightning strike, which I picked up, and I've actually just finished reading it today. But interestingly, on the same day, and I didn't know this previously, the same day was the inquest for the young boy that was killed, struck by lightning. And the coroner stated at that inquest that it was an extremely rare occurrence. Although the weather has changed, it changed very quickly, and there appears to be no obvious reason why Jordan was struck by lightning. And so just to try and put a positive spin on all of this, I think one thing that came out of the book by Elizabeth Crone and Jeffrey Kripal was that what Elizabeth Crone experienced was very much a positive NDE. And maybe that would offer some comfort to, say, Jordan's family in terms of where he's gone to. So that's worth thinking about as well. But just worth thinking about that all of these signs obviously have positives and negatives, but just thinking about what they actually mean. If we can think about the connectedness between people and events a bit more, that will kind of enhance the kind of the attitude towards holism, as opposed to this kind of highly individualistic culture that we're currently immersed in. So I've taken loads of time, so I will leave it there. Thank you very, very much for listening. I appreciate your time. And if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christof. You're just 2 minutes over, and that's just fine. I really appreciate your very personal self-analysis, if you will. And I think this is really what's needed. And as education chair for the Society for Scientific Exploration, I think the more that scientists can really delve into their own understanding of themselves and these phenomena is better. And I can think of two people, Imant Barousse, who wrote a book about, his own analysis of his dreams and things which were going on with his publications and things like that. He found some really very synchronous correlations. And also another scientist that comes to mind is Herb Metz, who wrote The Selection Effect, and it was himself struggling with the random generator and the outcome. And so it's a very personal recount, as is yours. And I think this is great because I think we make the biggest strides when we do this. We can't be the observer at this point. We have to really be the experiencer to go deep in it. So again, thank you so much. And so comments, we have Dr. Beth Hedva. Yes, and in non-Western cultures, less materialistic worldviews, your experiences might have been interpreted quite differently. True.
Absolutely.
Bill Everest, Stanislav and Christina Groff agreed that medication was counterproductive to the acknowledgement and development of such experiences. In 1980, while at Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, they established a spiritual emergency network, which was designed to help people who were having these types of unique experiences that were characterized as non-ordinary states of consciousness with perceptual variations, emotional fluctuation, or psychosomatic symptoms, and commonly defined as psychotic by conventional psychiatry. And I want to mention, I commend you for not succumbing to the drugs, because then you're literally screwed in every way of the word. So
absolutely. And I mean, I've come across the Spiritual Crisis Network in the UK, and I know the good work that they do, but I would say that it is still very much a marginal organization, and I don't think it's taken very seriously by the mainstream NHS over here. I mean, I'm not sure what the situation is in the US, but I really, that there needs to be people that, I mean, as Everton Moraldi was saying yesterday in his brilliant talk, you know, that there needs to be people who can understand the nuances of all of this, because I had no idea what was going on. You know, my worldview, I was a materialist. All I could say, I mean, I'd never had any thoughts about God or anything bigger. And, you know, I could only put it down to be a conspiracy. That was why all these meaningful coincidences were happening. But, you know, there was no other way of me interpreting that. And I just think if there was somebody there on the front line, because at that point, it wouldn't have even occurred to me to look for, say, a spiritual crisis network. You know, if there was someone on the front line that could introduce these ideas based on what I was saying, if they could introduce them kind of, obviously, in a subtle kind of way, then and maybe direct me towards Jung or whatever. But there has to be a better way of doing it. I'm sure of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark Mulaga says Reiki and energetic healer training tap into spikes in world energy when events are happening. They contend they feel ripples in the world energy. And then Ramses de Leon said there's also a spiritual emergency scale developed by Goretsky, Thalborn, and Storm in 2009. Dava Nars, I think a large part of the psi talent stems from complex and maybe abstract implicit pattern recognition and open the door to precognition. I agree that cascading synchronicities are crazy making and sound irrational to mainstream medical types. Is there a particular sector where you think you may exercise and fine line your gifts? RV, mediumship, forecasting, healing, etc. I think it's actually therapeutic and edifying when you can apply these abilities. Thank you for sharing your experience so openly.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to be able to. I mean, yeah, part of me being here at this conference, to be honest, is I suppose just, you know, working through the process. I mean, what I find quite interesting about all of these talks here is that they're absolutely, you know, spot on in so many ways. But this is still, you know, it's you know, we are still unfortunately very much in a marginal environment here, aren't we? You know, you go out onto the streets and most people, you don't accept any of this stuff, and there's got to be a way to try and make it more mainstream. I mean, you know, and even when they do accept it, you know, they won't talk about it because they won't talk about their experiences because of these taboos, and whether that comes down from, you know, people in positions of scientific authority essentially kind of dismissing this stuff, sometimes even unconsciously, you know, through the media or whatever. But, you know, I'm not saying go back to the medieval period, but I do think that there are aspects of the medieval period, and certainly, you know, say hunter-gatherer cultures today, the people who are a lot more in touch with nature and can see these things and incorporate them within their lives. And, you know, you have shamans and what have you. And surely there's got to be a way of making this stuff more mainstream in the Western world as well.
Yes, we have Chris Connolly. I found it interesting that you initially perceived your experiences from the perspective of paranoia, whereas individuals with a religious perspective may simply accept these experiences. Have these experiences changed the way you perceive such experience and perhaps life in general?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's a really interesting question, because again, watching Everton Moraldi's talk yesterday kind of bears on this a little bit, because he was talking about the fact that, you know, if you come from a kind of religious background and have these anomalous experiences, or you come from a particular spiritual church in Brazil and have these anomalous experiences, you have people that can kind of help you through. And one question I wanted to ask Everton, which I didn't have a chance to, was how would you adapt that approach to somebody who's literally having a flipping worldview? Because I didn't have that religious background at all, so it made no sense to me. And it only started to make sense after I started reading about Jung, and Jung having that kind of spiritual bent, as it were. You know, it started to make sense to me, and it was actually a relief, because for once I didn't feel like the whole world was against me. You know, so yeah. I mean, I think it would perhaps be, if I'd come from a religious background, it would make a lot more sense, because I would have the idea that there are things out there that that can generate these anomalous experiences. But I have to say, I came from, my family were very kind of atheist, I suppose, and then after that, I went to university and studied a science subject, so you couldn't get much more kind of materialist in a way, and I had nothing to basically understand this at all, no way of understanding it. And yes, so I absolutely agree with the question. I think, if I'd had that religious background, it would have helped quite a lot, actually.
Yeah, no, that was a very brilliant question. Margaret Moga asked, can you pick up other people's thoughts as well?
Do I pick up other people's thoughts?
Yes.
I don't. I never feel like I'm directly picking up people's thoughts. I think the way I describe it is it's all unconscious. I feel this is why I'm not a great believer in free will, is that what seems to happen is that I keep, as with all synchronicities, I keep bumping into things that have meaning, and it happens all the time. I have so much patterning in my life. It's not that I'm actually picking up thoughts of people, or but I do kind of, maybe I'll think about something and then something will happen shortly afterwards, which will make that meaningful coincidence. And it feels like I am a little bit of a meat puppet in a way, kind of being directed around, which I don't mind that much. But this is what has kind of driven me to this point where I think it would be interesting to learn this a bit more, because I have felt, to be honest, for years and years, that I've kind of been on my own with a lot of this. And that's partly because of my background, partly because I haven't found the right people who have experienced similar things. But I'm generally, my background is quite mainstream. I'm quite a mainstream person. So I would love to see this stuff more in the mainstream, so that more people can, so I can find more people who experience it, and so that other people in similar situations would be able to find similar people who have had similar experiences. I think that would be very, very important.
Yeah, and definitely, and not to suffer as much, to have to go through, the whole hospital thing and everything. This will be our final question, and I recommend, Christof, if there's a lot of nice comments in the chat, if you want to save the chat, you might want to do that now. Right. So you could read them later. But the final question is from Stephen Hall. Are we in a matrix? What do you think about the Radonauts and the app that guides their anomalous adventures?
Yeah, I mean, as far as that's concerned, that is totally what I believe. I basically believe that we're in basically a kind of a computer program, and that everything is kind of super determined. And for me, that's not a problem. I think some people have a real kind of a real need for free will, but I don't think that I think that living in a deterministic universe is not necessarily a bad thing. It has the potential to kind of, I guess, soften the retributive impulse, and make people a little bit less self-conscious, more playful, less likely to blame themselves, because everything was supposed to happen in the way it was supposed to happen. And we obviously still learn from experiences, but once those things have happened, you can kind of move on. And it's very much the idea of being here now, or the power of now, because you just think, well, I'm in this computer program, I am in this matrix. And it was supposed to happen in that way, and it's actually quite a release then, because you don't have to worry too much about blame or pride or whatever. So I think it's actually quite a liberating idea to believe in determinism rather than free will. But obviously, other people have other ideas. So.
Well, thank you so much, Krista. It was an absolutely fabulous presentation with a lot of great questions and comments.